In this session, we'll be looking at archaeology in the New Testament, some of the exciting discoveries recently that have brought to light many of the events and places that we can read about in Scripture. So that we might put things in proper chronological order and recall where we're at historically, let us look again at the time between the Testaments as we set up our study for the New Testament archaeology. You might recall that between the Testaments, several important historic events occurred. The Assyrian Empire fell to the Babylonians with the fall of Nineveh in 611. And then Babylon is defeated by Persia when Babylon, the city of Babylon, falls to the Persians in 539 BC. Persia then falls to the Greek under Alexander the Great in 330, and he extends his empire eastward. The Romans ascend. Then Rome extends its empire eastward and ascends to power. You might recall some of the important changes that took place between the Testaments, sometimes called the 400 silent years, but they're really not so silent because there were these empire changes. And whereas in the beginning we had the Assyrians still in power, the Babylonians then become powerful, the Greeks, and then the Romans. And with Rome going eastward, Rome defeats Antiochus, one of the Seleucid kings, a general of Alexander the Great, who took over part of the empire when Alexander died at a young age. And then the Romans impact Israel and that area after Pompey intervenes in the Judean Civil War. And this now brings us up to the time of fulfillment when Jesus is born. You might recall we looked in our study of the manuscripts at the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Isaiah scroll, which dates before Christ by at least 100 years, predicts the coming of the Messiah. And this was the scripture that the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts chapter 8 was reading from Isaiah 53, predicting the coming of Jesus. Now, during the coming of Jesus, of course, at his time, Herod the Great was in power. Herod the Great, as we mentioned, had his roots down around Petra. And so as we look at Herod the Great, we want to look at some of his building projects, both in Jerusalem, in Caesarea Maritima on the Mediterranean Sea, at Masada on the Dead Sea, and then at Herodium, not too far from Jerusalem. First of all, we want to look at archaeological sightings and findings in the land of Israel. We'll begin in Jerusalem. And we'll begin with one of the individuals who is responsible for many of the great structures from the first century. Herod the Great, who ruled from 73 BC till 4 BC, was a great builder. He was actually not a Jewish man, but an Edomian or Edomite from the Nabatean area near Petra. He had 10 sons by 10 wives, and some of the later descendants would be also rulers in Israel, and we read about them in the book of Acts. Herod built a temple in Jerusalem and also a great city at Caesarea Maritima. He also built Masada and Herodium. In the picture here, we have a model of Herod's palace in Jerusalem. In Matthew chapter 2, of course, Herod is the king that tried to kill baby Jesus, and some have wondered if he was really that cruel. But he actually had one of his wives killed and 2 of his sons, so he did have a mean streak in him for sure. His 3 sons later on divided up his kingdom. We're looking at the area of Herod's temple in Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. Presently, of course, there's a Muslim mosque on this area, but this probably is the real site of Herod's temple. To the south would be David's Jerusalem, an older part of the area. And now as we look at the city from the Mount of Olives, we see the temple area, and north of that would be the fortress of Antonia, where the Romans had their garrison in Jerusalem. Across the Kidron Valley was the Gethsemane Garden, and From that place you could see Herod's temple on the opposite side of the valley. It was a magnificent structure. Took a long time to build. In fact, wasn't finished when Jesus was born or even by the time of his death. The fortress of Antonia in this model shows the proximity. And it was always an irritant to the Jews that the Romans could look over into the temple area. There is a place below the present city of Jerusalem that some maintain is the fortress compound of Herod the Great, or in the Antonia Palace. And sometimes it is pictured that perhaps Jesus was tried before Pontius Pilate here in the fortress of Antonio. Today, though, you can see the steps that lead up to Herod's temple. These are from the 1st century, and this is the wall that surrounds the temple mound. Actually, you can see the damage to the walkway from the destruction of the temple, most likely in 70 A.D. These stones are badly damaged from the falling stones from the top of the wall. Close to the steps that lead up to the temple would be these Jewish cleansing mikvah places that the Jews would clean themselves up ceremonially before going into Herod's temple. Also, you can see about halfway up in the middle of this picture, Robinson's Arch, it's called. There was a bridge that spanned a small valley that led into the temple mound to Herod's temple. Very famous Wailing Wall still can be seen, and these are definitely stones from the time of Herod the Great in the 1st century. A temple warning inscription was found in 1871 and does date to the 1st century. This was to warn the Gentiles that they could not enter to this section of the temple. In fact, it says foreigners must not enter inside the railing or into the courtyard around the sanctuary. Whoever is caught will have himself to blame for his ensuing death. So Gentiles were not allowed in the inner part of the temple upon pain of death. Also, near the Sheep Gate in Jerusalem, from John chapter 5, we have the location of what is presumed to be Bethesda, the 5 porticos, where the lame man lay wanting to be healed. Also there on the outside of the old city walls are a traditional site of the crucifixion. It's called Gordon's Calvary or Golgotha. This is an uncertain place, but it is traditional, one of the sites that Jesus could have been crucified on. And not far from that is the Garden Tomb. And it again is traditional, and some would prefer the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as to where Jesus was buried and then raised from the dead. However, more likely, these steps that lead to Caiaphas, the high priest house, are from the 1st century. There was a cistern in this locality that at one time would have kept a great deal of water, but during the time of Jesus, apparently he was put down into this area, which was empty of water at that time, imprisoned on the night of his trial, and later to stand before Caiaphas and the others. In 1990, Caiaphas' ossuary box, which contained his bones, which dates from 42 to 43 AD, was found. An amazing find which has the name of Caiaphas, the high priest, inscribed on the exterior. Of greater uncertainty is an ossuary that has his daughter's bones in it. And even more uncertain perhaps, though greatly debated, is the James ossuary. In October of 2002, this was discovered. So some people think this is actually where James was buried. More recently, in 2004, the Pool of Siloam has been unearthed, and it apparently was a much larger pool than had originally been thought. And in John chapter 9, we can read about the events happening here at the Pool of Siloam, an amazing find just recently south of the old city of Jerusalem. These steps lead down into the Pool of Siloam. You can see from these steps, again, the depth of this pool. It was a very large pool. And coins have been found from the 1st century, which confirm the date of a 1st century for this find. Now going to Herodium. This is built by Herod himself, a volcanic-shaped mountain, cone-shaped mountain. He was built in 23 BC, 8 miles south of Jerusalem, and 3.5 miles east of Bethlehem. A great battle was fought here where Herod came to the forefront and defeated Mattathias Antigonus in 40 BC. 7 stories high, over 60 feet, and Herod's tomb, some place inside of this cone. Also, a palace is nearby. These stones, rolling stones, were used from the top of the cone to ward off any enemy. And in fact, Herod's tomb was most likely found in May 7th of 2007, dating back to 4 BC, an amazing find at Herodium. Herod also built Masada. He was somewhat paranoid of his following, as he knew he wasn't a Jew and not widely acclaimed or accepted by the Jewish people. He was always afraid, perhaps, that they might rebel against him, so he built Masada. It's on a very large cliff next to the Dead Sea. And though he never actually had to retreat here, the Jews who rebelled in 66 AD, as the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, they came down to Masada. And then the Romans laid siege to it and built a ramp up and finally captured Masada, with most of the individuals there committing suicide, over 900. Also at Masada there was a synagogue, and some Dead Sea Scrolls were found in this synagogue as well. Herod was also known for building Caesarea Maritima, Caesarea on the Mediterranean Sea, an amazing city where he stayed most of the time. He built man-made harbor, the largest man-made harbor in the Mediterranean, so that ships could dock there. He also had a palace right on the coast, and a very beautiful and ornate palace it was. The large theater is at Caesarea, which to this day houses and holds productions much as the same as they would have been in the 1st century. Of course, one of the problems in much of Israel is getting water. It's a very dry country for the most part. But Herod built an aqueduct which was 23 miles long to the base of Mount Carmel and brought water all the way from there into the city of Caesarea. An amazing structure. Of great interest to us as scholars of the New Testament is an inscription found in 1961 called the Pilate inscription. It was discovered by an Italian archaeologist, Antonio Frova. And it has in it a reference to Pontius Pilate. It says, Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Judea, erected a building dedicated to the Emperor Tiberius. So this is one of the few inscriptions with Pontius Pilate's name on it. But also recently, we have found coins with Pontius Pilate's name, and more recently, a ring found at Herodium with Pontius Pilate's name on the ring. As Jesus began speaking and traveling about, some of the places he went we want to look at briefly. He went to Chorazin, and at Chorazin there are ruins of a synagogue which most likely does not date back to the time of Jesus, but perhaps built upon sites, earlier sites that do date back that far. Very beautiful place, but Chorazin was one that rejected Jesus and was cursed and remains in rubble to this day. Also at Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus traveled, much in the northeast of Israel, one of the sources of the Jordan River here, a very beautiful place. City built to honor Caesar and by Philip, one of the descendants of Herod the Great. But it was also a pagan worship site, and it's perhaps one reason Jesus asked here why or who people thought he was. Perhaps he saw all the idolatry around him. This is another site of one of the sources of the Jordan River. Next we come to Capernaum on the northwest shore of the Sea of Galilee. Very beautiful place. And we have some significant finds from the first century here. The synagogue, probably that stands before us in this picture, is from the 4th century. Most people do believe it was built upon earlier synagogues from the 1st century. Capernaum also is known as the place where Jesus lived after he was rejected in Nazareth. And Peter's house was here, or home was here. And there is a site, an octagonal church building was built over a very early site from the 1st century. There was much Christian graffiti found in this site, and so it's fairly well recognized and accepted as possibly being the place Peter, the apostle, lived in Capernaum. Next to that and between the synagogue are several 1st century homes. You can see now there is a large church building built over Peter's home, but you can look down into it and see what it might have looked like in the 1st century. Of
course, Peter was a fisherman along with several of the other apostles, and in 1986 there was a very severe drought, and the Sea of Galilee retreated tremendously, and there was found a boat from the first century. Because the water receded so much, this boat was now visible. It was taken out of the sea where it was and reconstructed, and now you can see it in a museum just not far from Capernaum.
One of the best preserved or excavated cities in Israel from the Roman times is at Beth Shean. After Pompey invaded Syria in 64 BC, Pompey instructs his legate, Gabinius, to build a new Greco-Roman city at Beth Shean. The ruins here are very extensive. They illustrate the beauty and cosmopolitan nature of a Roman city during the time of Jesus. The ruins include a magnificent theater, there is a Roman bath at Beth Shean, which shows the luxurious lifestyle that they were able to enjoy. The mosaics on the street show the extensive building and decorative aspect of this most cosmopolitan and Roman city. Also, the shops along one of the major roads show a very great business area. Beth Shean and the major boulevard show again what a great city this would have been and how impressive it would have been to those who would travel through here. And perhaps Jesus himself had gone through Beth Shean and seen this city in its glory.
Another inscription that we looked at in our reference to some of the inscriptions about Jesus is the Nazareth inscription, an inscription that Emperor Claudius had put up in Nazareth. And it mentions the fact that no longer shall people be raiding the tomb, because from now on, if anybody does that, they can expect the death penalty. That concludes a look at some of the sites in Israel. And next we want to look at some of the sites from Paul's missionary journeys.